Rosalie Chun stared at the eviction notice taped to her office door, her hands trembling as she read the words that spelled the end of everything she'd worked for. 3 years of building enchanted events for nothing, only to watch it crumble. Because her business partner had emptied their accounts and disappeared with their biggest client. The September rain drummed against the windows of her tiny Manhattan office, each drop echoing the hollow feeling in her chest. 28 years old, and she was about to lose her apartment, her business, and what little dignity she had left. Her phone buzzed with another call from a creditor she couldn't pay. "Miss Chun?" A deep voice made her spin around. A man stood in her doorway, water dripping from his expensive coat. Tall, broad-shouldered, with steel-gray eyes and the kind of presence that commanded attention. She'd never seen him before, but something about him seemed familiar. "We're closed," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Actually, we're permanently closed as of tomorrow." "I know." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "My name is Marcus Blackwood. I believe you know my work." Her breath caught. Everyone in event planning knew Marcus Blackwood, heir to the Blackwood fortune, owner of the most exclusive venues in the city. His family's empire had been built over 4 generations, and he was notoriously private, never appearing at the events held in his properties. "Mr. Blackwood, if this is about the Richmond wedding we had to cancel." "It's not." He moved closer, his expensive shoes silent on the worn carpet. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear me out completely before you answer." Rosalie wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how small and shabby her office must look to someone like him. "I'm listening." "I need a wife." The words hung in the air between them, stark and impossible. Not for love, not for companionship, for business. Legal business that requires a marriage certificate and a woman willing to play the role for exactly 1 year. She blinked, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" Marcus pulled out a leather portfolio, extracting a thick document. "My grandfather's will contains a clause requiring me to be married before my 30th birthday, which is in 3 months. If I'm not, the family fortune, including all the properties, investments, and businesses, goes to my cousin Trevor. That single quotes S. Medieval. That's family tradition." His jaw tightened. "My grandfather believed marriage provided stability and responsibility. Trevor would sell everything within a year and destroy 4 generations of work." Rosalie stared at him, trying to process what he was suggesting. "Why me? You could marry anyone. You're Marcus Blackwood. Because you're smart, professional, and desperate enough to consider this seriously." His honesty was brutal, but not unkind. "Because you understand business arrangements and wouldn't confuse this with romance. And because I've watched you work." "Watched me work?" The Morrison Charity Gala last spring, the Henderson Anniversary Party, the corporate retreat for Davidson Industries. He counted them on his fingers. You handled each event flawlessly, even when things went wrong. You're calm under pressure, creative, and you don't get starstruck around wealthy people. Heat rose in her cheeks. She remembered those events. They'd been held in Blackwood Properties, but she'd never seen him there. "You were watching me?" "I was looking for someone exactly like you." Marcus set the portfolio on her desk. "The contract is straightforward. 1 year of marriage in name only. You'll receive a signing bonus of $100,000 monthly, payments of $50,000, and a final payment of $500,000 when the marriage ends. All your debts will be paid immediately." The numbers made her dizzy. Nearly $1 million for pretending to be married to a man she'd never met. It was insane, impossible, too good to be true. What would I have to do? Attend social functions as my wife. Live in the penthouse. Maintain the appearance of a happy marriage when we're in public. His voice was businesslike, as if he were. discussing catering options, complete privacy and independence when we're not, separate bedrooms, separate lives that occasionally intersect for show. Rosalie looked around her failing office, at the stack of unpaid bills on her desk, at the eviction notice that would make her homeless by Friday. Then she looked at Marcus Blackwood, his stranger offering her a lifeline wrapped in the most unconventional package imaginable. I need time to think. You have until midnight tonight. He moved toward the door, then paused. Miss Chun, I'm not a kind man, but I'm an honest one. This arrangement will benefit both of us, nothing more. Don't expect romance or emotional connection. I'm offering you a business deal that will solve your problems and mine. After he left, Rosalie sat in her quiet office as rain continued to fall, holding a contract that could change her life forever. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, unaware that her entire future hung in the balance of one impossible decision. At 11:47 p.m., she called the number on Marcus Blackwood's business card. I accept, she said when he answered. When do we start? Detective Nina Torres had seen plenty of unusual cases in her 15 years with the NYPD, but a marriage contract worth nearly $1 million definitely made her top 10 list of things that seemed too weird to be legal. She sat across from Judge Harold Whitmore in his chambers, both of them reviewing the documents that had been brought to their attention by a concerned family member. What exactly are we looking at here, Your Honor? Torres asked, adjusting her reading glasses. The detective was known for her sharp instincts and her refusal to let things slide just because they involved wealthy people. Judge Whitmore, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, sighed deeply. A perfectly legal marriage contract, unfortunately. Marcus Blackwood's grandfather was very specific about the terms of his will, and this arrangement satisfies all the requirements. But someone thinks it's fraud? Trevor Blackwood, Marcus's cousin, filed the complaint. He believes the marriage is a sham designed to circumvent the will's true intentions. The judge handed her another document. He's hired private investigators and is demanding a full investigation. Torres scanned the complaint, noting Trevor's accusations. Says here that Marcus Blackwood has never been seen in public with this woman before 3 weeks ago, when they suddenly announced their engagement. No dating history, no mutual friends, nothing. Which could describe any number of private relationships, Judge Whitmore pointed out. Wealthy people often keep their personal lives out of the public eye. Or it could describe a business arrangement masquerading as marriage. Torres tapped her pen against the desk. What's your gut telling you? The judge was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the courthouse steps where reporters had been gathering all week. The Blackwood story had captured the city's attention. The mysterious billionaire, the sudden marriage, the family fortune hanging in the balance. My gut tells me that Marcus Blackwood is a man trying to honor his grandfather's wishes while protecting his family's legacy. But my legal obligation is to ensure that the marriage is genuine if Trevor's challenge has merit. So what do you need from me? Observe them. Marcus and Rosalie Blackwood are required to appear at several public events as part of the will's stipulations. Watch how they interact. Look for signs that this is purely transactional. Judge Whitmore handed her a file. If you find evidence of fraud, we'll investigate further. If not, Trevor's challenge fails and the inheritance stands. Torres opened the file, studying photos of the couple. Marcus Blackwood looked exactly like what he was: wealthy, powerful, controlled. But Rosalie Chun now, Rosalie Blackwood, was harder to read. In some photos, she looked nervous, overwhelmed. In others, she seemed genuinely happy, laughing at something Marcus had said. When's their first public appearance? Tomorrow night. The Metropolitan Museum Gala. 500 of the city's most influential people will be watching every move they make. The next evening, Torres positioned herself among the museum's guests, her detective's badge replaced by an evening gown borrowed from her sister. She watched as Marcus and Rosalie entered the grand hall, noting the way every conversation stopped as they passed. They looked perfect together, Marcus in his tailored tuxedo, Rosalie stunning in a midnight blue gown that transformed her from the nervous woman in the courthouse photos into someone who belonged in this glittering world. But Torres was watching for the details that others would miss. How? Marcus's hand settled naturally at the small of Rosalie's back as they moved through the crowd. How Rosa laughed, not the forced sound of someone playing a role, but genuine amusement at something he whispered in her ear. How they unconsciously mirrored each other's movements, turning toward each other when they spoke, as if the rest of the room had faded away. Detective Torres? A voice behind her made her turn. Trevor Blackwood stood there, a man in his 30s, with the soft features of someone who'd never worked a day in his life. His eyes held a calculating coldness that immediately put her on guard. Mr. Blackwood, I didn't expect to see you here. I have as much right to attend these events as my dear cousin. His smile was sharp. What do you think of their performance? Quite convincing, isn't it? Torres watched as Marcus introduced Rosalie to a group of business associates, noting how protectively he stood beside her, how he seemed to anticipate her needs before she voiced them. It looks like a married couple to me, she said carefully. Look closer. Trevor nodded toward the couple. Watch how she hesitates before taking his arm, how he has to remember to touch her. It's all choreographed, detective. They're playing roles, but Torres was watching something else entirely. She saw the moment Rosalie stumbled slightly in her heels, and how Marcus steadied her without thinking, his hand gentle but sure. She saw Rosalie brush an invisible speck from his lapel, the gesture intimate and unconscious. She saw two people who were trying very hard to maintain professional distance, but failing in small, telling ways. Mr. Blackwood, Torres said, turning to face Trevor directly. Can I ask why you're so determined to prove this marriage is fake? His mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. Because I know my cousin. Marcus doesn't believe in love, doesn't trust anyone. Enough for real intimacy. This is a business deal, and he's manipulating the system to steal what should be mine. Or maybe he's a man who found someone worth fighting for, Torres replied, watching as Marcus and Rosalie moved on to the dance floor. They danced like people learning to trust each other, careful but gradually relaxing into the rhythm. Not the smooth perfection of a rehearsed performance, but the tentative beauty of something real beginning to grow. As the evening ended and Torres prepared her report for Judge Whitmore, she found herself thinking about the complexity of human connection. Maybe Marcus and Rosalie's marriage had started as a business arrangement, but watching them tonight, she'd seen something that couldn't be faked or choreographed. The spark of two people discovering they might actually like each other. Her report would reflect what she'd observed. A couple still finding their way, but genuine in their efforts to build something together. Whether that something would survive, the year-long contract remained to be seen. Victoria Ashford had always believed that Marcus Blackwood would come crawling back to her eventually. After all, she was the one who'd ended their engagement 2 years ago, choosing a tech billionaire in Silicon Valley over the old money traditionalist, who bored her with his talk of family legacy and responsibility. She'd assumed Marcus would spend years pining for her, making her eventual return to his life all the sweeter. The news of his marriage had been a shock that shattered her perfectly manicured world. You're certain about this? She asked Dr. James, Sterling, as they sat in the upscale cafe where they'd been meeting secretly for the past month. James was a psychiatrist who specialized in wealthy families, with a practice that catered to the guilt and anxieties of the elite. He was also someone who understood the value of information and wasn't above using it for personal gain. Absolutely certain. James stirred his coffee, with deliberate precision. I've been treating Trevor Blackwood for anxiety related to the inheritance situation. He's hired investigators, filed legal challenges, and now he's desperate enough to consider more ... creative solutions. Victoria smiled, the expression sharp enough to cut glass. She was 32, beautiful in the way that money could perfect, with platinum blonde hair and ice blue eyes that had charmed their way through Manhattan's social circles. But beneath the polished exterior was a woman who'd never accepted being told no. What kind of creative solutions? The marriage needs to be proven fraudulent within the next 9 months, or Marcus inherits everything. James leaned forward conspiratorially. Trevor is willing to pay handsomely for evidence that the marriage is a sham. But he's also interested in ... alternative approaches, such as ending the marriage through other means. Infidelity, for instance. If Rosalie Blackwood were to be caught in a compromising position with another man, Marcus would have grounds for divorce. The will specifically requires an intact marriage. A divorce would invalidate the inheritance clause. Victoria's mind was already working, calculating possibilities. She'd met Rosalie briefly at a charity event years ago when she was still an unknown event planner. Pretty in an unremarkable way, clearly out of her depth in high society, the kind of woman who would crumble under the right pressure. I assume you have someone in mind for this compromising position? James smiled. I've been treating Marcus for what I diagnosed as commitment issues and trust difficulties stemming from our previous relationship. I have detailed notes about his psychological vulnerabilities, his fears about betrayal, his tendency to withdraw when he feels threatened. You're going to use his therapy sessions against him? I'm going to help him realize that his current marriage is another mistake waiting to happen. And you, my dear Victoria, are going to be the catalyst that opens his eyes. 3 weeks later, Victoria put their plan into motion. She'd been watching the Blackwood penthouse, learning Marcus and Rosalie's routines. Marcus left for work at exactly 7:30 each morning, returning around 6 in the evening. Rosalie worked from home most days, handling the social calendar and charitable commitments that came with being Mrs. Marcus Blackwood. Victoria chose a Thursday afternoon when she knew Marcus would be in meetings all day. She arrived at the penthouse with a story prepared about needing to retrieve some personal items she'd left behind years ago, items she'd actually planted in the apartment the previous week through a bribed housekeeper. Victoria? Rosalie opened the door, surprise and wariness crossing her features. What are you doing here? I'm so sorry to bother you, Rosalie. I know this is awkward, but I left some jewelry in Marcus's safe when we were together. Family pieces that belonged to my grandmother. I was hoping I could retrieve them. Rosalie hesitated, clearly uncomfortable but too polite to refuse. Marcus isn't here right now. Maybe you could come back when, please. I'm flying back to California tonight. It would mean so much to me. Victoria let tears gather in her eyes, a trick she'd perfected in her teens. These pieces are all I have left of my grandmother. Against her better judgment, Rosalie let her inside. Victoria moved through the penthouse like she still belonged there, noting the changes Rosalie had made: warmer colors, family photos, touches that made the space feel like a home rather than a showpiece. You've redecorated, Victoria observed, her tone carefully neutral. Just a few changes. Rosalie seemed nervous, fidgeting with her wedding ring. Marcus said I could make it feel more comfortable. How modern of him. He never let me change anything when we lived here. The lie rolled easily off Victoria's tongue. She'd never lived in the penthouse, but Rosalie wouldn't know that as they walked toward the study where the safe was located. Victoria continued her psychological assault. I have to say, I'm impressed. I never thought Marcus would remarry after what happened between us. He was so hurt when I left, so convinced that he couldn't trust anyone again. Rosalie's steps faltered, slightly, He seems to have worked through those issues. Has he? Victoria stopped, turning to face her directly. Has he told you why I really left? About the other women, the way he compartmentalized his life so completely that I felt like a stranger in his bed? The words hit their mark. Rosalie's face went pale, and Victoria saw the seeds of doubt taking root. This was almost too easy. I don't think we should be discussing. Of course, you're right. I'm sorry. Victoria's voice softened with false sympathy. It's just that I care about Marcus, despite everything. And I worry about him making the same mistakes again. In the study, Victoria made a show of retrieving non-existent jewelry from the safe, using the time to plant more poison. She talked about Marcus's supposed commitment issues, his tendency to withdraw emotionally, his pattern of treating relationships like business transactions. The thing is, Victoria said as she prepared to leave, Marcus has never learned how to actually be vulnerable with someone. He thinks marriage is about contracts and obligations, not trust and intimacy. I tried to teach him differently, but... She shrugged sadly. After Victoria left, Rosalie sat alone in the penthouse, her mind churning with doubts she'd been trying to suppress for weeks. Was their marriage really just business to Marcus? Had she been foolish to think she'd seen glimpses of something deeper? That evening, when Marcus returned home, Rosalie was quieter than usual. She watched him with new eyes, looking for signs of the emotional distance Victoria had described. When he asked about her day, she mentioned Victoria's visit, but not the conversation that had followed. Victoria's plan was working perfectly. She'd planted the seeds of doubt and mistrust, exploiting the natural insecurities of a marriage built on a contract rather than love. Now all she had to do was wait for those seeds to grow, creating the cracks in Marcus and Rosalie's relationship that she could use to destroy them both. But Victoria had underestimated one crucial factor, the genuine feelings that had been growing between Marcus and Rosalie, despite their best efforts to maintain professional distance. Love, even when it's trying to hide, has a way of fighting back against deception. Benjamin Cross had been a private investigator for 20 years. Long enough to recognize when a case was more complicated than it appeared on the surface. The Blackwood inheritance situation had all the hallmarks of a family drama with deeper, darker roots than a simple dispute over money. He sat across from Stella Reeves, the family lawyer who'd been handling Blackwood legal affairs for the past decade. In her mahogany-paneled office overlooking Central Park, Stella was in her 50s, sharp-minded, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of professional composure that came from years of dealing with wealthy families and their complicated secrets. Tell me about the grandfather, Benjamin said, reviewing his notes. Why did he really include the marriage clause in his will? Stella poured herself a cup of tea with steady hands, but Benjamin noticed the slight tremor in her fingers. Edward Blackwood was a complicated man. Brilliant businessman, devoted family patriarch, but he carried some heavy burdens. What kind of burdens? The kind that come from making difficult choices to protect people you love. Stella sat down, her cup carefully. Edward discovered something about Trevor that he never shared with the rest of the family. Something that convinced him Trevor should never inherit the Blackwood fortune. Benjamin leaned forward. What did he discover? Stella was quiet for a long moment, weighing her professional obligations against her moral ones. Finally, she opened a locked drawer in her desk and withdrew a manila envelope. 3 years ago, Edward hired me to investigate some irregularities in Trevor's personal finances. Trevor was supposed to be managing a family charitable foundation, but Edward noticed discrepancies in the books. Embezzlement? Worse. Stella handed him the envelope. Trevor had been using the foundation as his personal piggy bank, but he was also involved with some very dangerous people. Money laundering, offshore accounts, connections to organized crime. Benjamin opened the envelope, scanning bank statements, photographs, and surveillance reports. The evidence was damning. Trevor Blackwood wasn't just a spoiled rich kid. He was a criminal who'd been using his family name as cover for increasingly serious illegal activities. Edward confronted him. Stella continued. Gave him a choice. Leave the country quietly and never return, or face prosecution. Trevor chose exile, but he never stopped resenting being cut off from the family fortune. So the marriage clause wasn't about tradition. It was about keeping Trevor away from the money. Edward knew that Marcus was honorable, responsible, someone who would use the family fortune to build rather than destroy. But he also knew that Trevor would challenge any will that excluded him completely. The marriage requirement was Edward's way of buying time, giving Marcus a chance to establish legal claim to the inheritance before Trevor could mount a serious challenge. Benjamin studied the documents, pieces of a larger puzzle falling into place. But Trevor came back anyway, 6 months ago. He's been careful, operating through intermediaries, but he's definitely here. Stella's voice carried a note of fear. And he's not just interested in challenging the will anymore. He wants revenge. Against Marcus? Against the entire family. Edward, Marcus, anyone who stood in his way. Stella stood, moving to the window. I think Trevor is planning something bigger than a legal challenge. The private investigators, the attempts to prove the marriage is fraudulent. That's all smokescreen. He's looking for another way to get what he believes is rightfully his. Benjamin felt a chill of recognition. He'd seen this pattern before family. Disputes that escalated into something dangerous when legitimate legal options failed. What aren't you telling me? Stella turned back to him, her face pale. Edward didn't die of natural causes. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Benjamin set down the documents, his mind racing through the implications. You think Trevor killed his own grandfather? I think Trevor is capable of anything when it comes to money and power. Edward's death was ruled natural heart attack, brought on by stress, but the timing was suspicious. He died just 3 weeks after changing his will to include the marriage clause. Why didn't you go to the police? With what evidence? A grandson with financial problems and a grandfather who died of a heart attack. Trevor was in Europe at the time, or at least that's what his passport records show. Stella returned to her desk, her hands shaking slightly. But I've never believed in coincidences, especially not when this much money is involved. Benjamin closed the envelope, his investigators' instincts screening that they were dealing with something far more serious than inheritance fraud. What does Marcus know about all this? Nothing. Edward made me promise to keep Trevor's criminal activities secret unless Marcus was in immediate danger. He thought knowledge of Trevor's true nature would consume Marcus with anger and revenge, distract him from building the life Edward wanted for him. But if Trevor is as dangerous as you believe, then Marcus and his wife are in more danger than they realize. Stella met his eyes directly. That marriage might have started as a business arrangement, Mr. Cross, but it's become something that could get them both killed. Benjamin gathered the documents, his mind already working on next steps. He needed to investigate Trevor's current activities, find out who he was working with, and determine the real threat level. But most importantly, he needed to warn Marcus. And Rosalie, without revealing the full extent of the danger they faced. As he prepared to leave, Stella caught his arm. There's one more thing. Dr. James Sterling, the psychiatrist who's been treating both Trevor and Marcus, I think he's involved. His sudden interest in the Blackwood family, his willingness to violate doctor-patient confidentiality, the timing of his appearance in their lives. It's too convenient to be coincidental. Benjamin nodded grimly. The case was becoming more complex by the hour, with layers of deception and danger that went far beyond a simple marriage contract. Trevor Blackwood wasn't just trying to claim an inheritance. He was orchestrating a carefully planned revenge that could destroy everything Edward Blackwood had built. Time was running out, and Marcus and Rosalie were walking into a trap they didn't even know existed. That evening, Benjamin made 2 phone calls. The first was to Marcus Blackwood's office, requesting an urgent meeting. The second was to Detective Nina Torres, asking her to look into Trevor Blackwood's recent activities and associates. The contract marriage that had begun as a solution to a legal problem was about to become a fight for survival. 9 months had passed since Rosalie first signed the contract that changed her life, and the Blackwood penthouse felt more like home than anywhere she'd ever lived. But home, she'd learned, could be as fragile as the paper their marriage was. Written on. Marcus stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights blur through the November rain. The past week had been a whirlwind of revelations. Benjamin Cross's investigation, the truth about Trevor's criminal activities, the revelation that their marriage had inadvertently placed them both in danger. Most shocking of all was the growing certainty that his grandfather's death hadn't been natural. "The contract expires in 3 months," Rosalie said quietly from the doorway. She'd been watching him stand there for the past hour, both of them avoiding the conversation they needed to have. Marcus turned, and she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of carrying secrets that had threatened to destroy everything. "I know." They stood in the living room that Rosalie had transformed from a showcase into a home, surrounded by the life they'd built together in small, careful increments. Family photos on the mantel, books they'd both read scattered on tables, a throw blanket draped over the couch where they'd fallen asleep watching movies they both pretended to hate but secretly enjoyed. "Trevor's been arrested," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "Detective Torres called an hour ago. They found enough evidence of money laundering and fraud to hold him for a long time." Rosalie felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Trevor's arrest meant the immediate danger was over, but it also meant they no longer needed the protection their marriage provided. The original reason for their contract securing Marcus's inheritance had been resolved months ago. Now they were left with a more complicated question. What happened when a business arrangement became something neither of them had planned for? And Dr. Sterling? Lost his medical license, facing charges for conspiracy and violation of doctor-patient confidentiality. Marcus moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, see the fine lines around his eyes that had appeared during the stress of recent weeks. Victoria's been blacklisted from every social circle in the city. Turns out people don't. Like being part of someone else's revenge fantasy. So it's over. The legal part, yes. Marcus reached out, then stopped, his hand falling to his side. They'd been careful for months to maintain physical distance, to honor the no emotional involvement clause even as their feelings grew stronger. Now, with the contract nearly expired, that careful distance felt like a chasm neither knew how to cross. Rosalie had fallen in love with him gradually, in moments she hadn't expected. The morning she'd found him making coffee for her before. An important meeting, remembering exactly how she liked it. The evening he'd held her while she cried over a phone call from her estranged mother. The night he'd stayed up until 3 a.m., helping her prepare a presentation, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights that made her work better. She'd fallen in love with his integrity, his quiet strength, the way he treated everyone, from the doorman to the mayor, with the same respectful attention. She'd fallen in love with the man who read poetry when he thought no one was looking, who donated anonymously to animal shelters, who called his elderly neighbor Mrs. Patterson every Sunday just to check on her. "What happens now?" she asked, the question barely audible. Marcus was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he'd been suppressing for months. "I don't know. The contract gave us both an exit strategy, a clean end with no complications. In 3 months, you'll be financially secure, free to start whatever." life you want, and you'll have your inheritance, your family legacy secured. Yes, he paused, running a hand through his hair. But somewhere along the way, the contract stopped being enough. The admission hung between them, dangerous and beautiful. Rosalie felt her heart racing, hope and fear warring in her chest. They'd been so careful to maintain the boundaries they'd agreed to, but those boundaries had been eroding for months. Marcus, I know what we agreed to. He cut her off, but gently. I know you signed up for a business arrangement, not for someone to fall in love with you. I know the last thing you need is more complications in your life. What if I want the complications? The question surprised them both. Rosalie hadn't planned to say it, but the words came from a place deeper than strategy or fear. They came from 9 months of discovering that love could grow in the most unexpected places, between two people who'd thought they were too damaged to trust again. Marcus stared at her, and she saw her own feelings reflected in his eyes: hope, fear, the desperate wish that they could find a way to make this work outside the safety of a legal contract. The marriage was supposed to be temporary, he said. It still can be, if that's what you want. Rosalie's voice was steadier than she felt. We can honor the contract, part ways as planned, and pretend the past 9 months were just business. Or we can choose something different, something real. She took a step closer, close enough to touch him if she found the courage. Not because a contract requires it, but because we want to. Marcus reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made her breath catch. Are you sure? Because once we cross this line, there's no going back to the safety of our business arrangement. I'm tired of being safe. Rosalie whispered, I'm tired of pretending I don't love you. The words released something that had been building between them for months. Marcus kissed her, and it was nothing like the careful, public displays they'd performed for cameras and social events. This was raw, honest, full of months of suppressed longing and the terrifying joy of finally admitting what they'd both known for weeks. When they broke apart, Marcus rested his forehead against hers. I love you too. God help me. I love you more than I thought possible. So what do? We tear up the contract, Marcus said, his voice sure for the first time in months. We start over, build something together that's not based on legal obligations or financial arrangements. We choose each other every day for as long as it works. Rosalie smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. No more contracts? Just promises. The kind people make when they decide to build a life together. 6 months later, they renewed their vows in a small ceremony in Central Park, surrounded by friends who'd watched their fake marriage become something beautifully real. Benjamin Cross was there, having become an unlikely friend through their shared ordeal. Detective Torres attended with her wife, still amazed by how a case that had started with suspicion had ended with genuine love. Stella Reeves gave a toast about the power of second chances and the courage it takes to choose love over safety. Even Judge Whitmore attended, delighting in seeing a legal arrangement transform into something that restored his faith in human connection. As they danced to music played by a string quartet they'd hired themselves, no contract required, Rosalie realized that sometimes the best love stories begin with the most practical arrangements. Sometimes two people need the safety of a business deal to discover they're brave enough for something much more dangerous and wonderful. Their love story had started with a contract, but it would continue with something far more powerful. The daily choice to choose each other, complications and all. Mrs. Blackwood, Marcus whispered as they swayed together under the autumn sky. Mrs. Blackwood, she agreed, and this time the title felt like a promise rather than a role she was playing. The contract of hearts had become something neither of them had dared to hope for. A love worth fighting for, worth choosing, worth building a lifetime around.